We've got Bryant Corky Messner, who is a candidate for U.S. Senate, um, here with us, and we're going to just dive right in. Um, One of the things um, that defined your primary run um, is you've been endorsed by President Trump for the seat. And it seems that a lot of your positions align with his. Um, can you give us an idea of an area of disagreement between you and the president on a policy issue?
Sure. Well, first of all, I would say um, I don't believe that some of the verbiage that he uses at times in Twitter is something I would do. Um, so communication wise, um, I think some of the things he does is helpful and productive, and I think some of the things he tweets and communicates I wouldn't do. So that's the first thing I would like to say. On the policy side of this, I hope. I mean, I think using tariffs as leverage to negotiate, fair and free trade is okay, but I don't believe tariffs in the long run is the right thing to do. So again, I think we have to wait and see what happens there. I think also I agree with the president on bringing troops home. But I also believe that we need to strengthen our alliances with our friends overseas, and to the extent that those alliances, involve military commitments, like NATO, that we ought to make sure those commitments are in fact honored and reasonable. So there's a few.
Okay. Well, we're going to talk about a couple of those topics in a bit. But Cecily wanted to bring up something that's a little bit more pressing.
Okay.
So I have some questions. We did a survey asking our community members what they'd like the candidates to be talking about during the campaign. So I have some questions from our readers. These are about the coronavirus. And the first question is, what more needs to be done to stem the tide of the virus and to get the economy back on track?
Yeah. Yeah. I think to get the economy back on track is very, very important. And what I've seen on the ground around the state is the small business owners, following the guidance to open up their businesses in a safe way in this COVID-19 economy, and the creativity of small business owners has really impressed me. They know that for their business to be successful, that their customers must feel safe going there, and they are looking at the guidance provided by the state, Governor Sununu, and by the federal government, and they are following that guidance to open up their businesses safely. I can tell you it's working here in New Hampshire. Our unemployment is down to 5.1%, and I see help wanted signs all over the state. And I think empowering small business owners, empowering people to follow the guidelines and conduct business safely is working, and jobs are coming back, and we need to continue to empower people with the resources they need and the guidelines they need and any financial assistance they need to get this economy going. The other part of your question was what more should be done?
Yep, the first part was what more should be done to help stem the tide of the virus?
Yes. I think, we need to continue working on the vaccine, and hopefully that we'll get something back quickly on the vaccine. I know they're in, I think, stage 3 testing on 6 vaccines. We need to continue to work on therapeutics to treat people who actually have COVID-19. We need to be super careful with our long-term care facilities and those who are in high risk categories, and provide those facilities as much assistance and help as they need. And then I think, we need to be good neighbors with each other. And for example, on the whole mask controversy, I don't think it should be a controversy in my view. I want to be a good neighbor. So when I'm out going to the grocery store, I wear a mask. It really, what my opinion might be about the efficacy of wearing a mask, I kind of view as irrelevant. I want to be a good neighbor and make sure people feel safe. So I think that kind of individual responsibility and looking out for each other and caring for each other is really important in this situation. And mask is only one example. Social distancing and being respectful to each other during this time is super important.
And if you were elected to the Senate, what kind of legislation would you put forth to help people who've lost their jobs because of COVID-19? Or you mentioned small businesses, many of whom have been just hit so hard
Yes.
by COVID-19.
Yeah, I had a business roundtable on Monday and talking about that subject exactly. And so a couple things. I think the proposal that the Republicans put forth in the U.S. Senate about 10, 12 days ago was a good proposal. It was $500 billion. And there was $300 a week unemployment enhancement in that proposal. And help for small businesses and more PPP loans. And I think it was a good proposal, and the Democrats said no to it. And it was a good first step. That doesn't mean it was the end of it. But people who need help, we should provide them help. I think we have to sort of navigate the unemployment situation carefully, because I've heard from a lot of small business owners that it's been difficult hiring people back because of the previously high enhanced unemployment. And so I think we have to navigate that carefully to make sure we're not providing an incentive for people not to work, but at the same time, we're helping people who need the help. As I said, there's a lot of help wanted signs around the state. And our unemployment here is now 5.1. So I think very targeted, helpful legislation. I think with municipalities, with first responders, of course we want those folks to have enough funding to do their jobs and have enough staff on hand, and the hospital communities as well. Now I had a discussion with some hospital executives, and I asked that very question: what more help do you need? And they said they were in pretty good shape. But still, we need to keep our finger on the pulse and see who needs help, and have that targeted, specific help, and make sure the spending on this is not frivolous.
I wonder if I could just interject a quick follow-up. The Senate, the Republican Senate proposal, as I understand it, did not offer any relief in the area of evictions, and so there's a concern. The president has taken action to put in a moratorium, but that doesn't provide relief for people who are not paying their rent because of the moratorium. When that moratorium runs out, nor does it provide any relief to landlords who are in effect carrying the burden of the moratorium. So I wonder, Is that a mistake of the Republicans? Because I believe it was in the Democratic proposal. If not, is there something that should be done?
Yeah. As you mentioned, the president did put in place a moratorium, and I think it's an issue that needs to be looked at and addressed in a sensible, common sense way. And you're right. This is it becomes a domino effect, right? If there's the moratorium is good now because the dominoes are that the tenant doesn't pay rent, the landlord doesn't get money to pay their mortgage, so the mortgage holder's not getting paid, and you got the way the system is set up. If there's not some relief in that chain, you got a mortgage holder who could foreclose on the owner, who could evict the tenants. So I think that entire structure, we need to make sure that we're providing appropriate help where it's needed. And I think given the fact that there's a moratorium, I don't think it was a mistake that wasn't included. It could be a next step package as we see how this thing is playing out more. I've talked to some landlords that, are in fact, forgiving rental payments, because landlords generally know they're much better off to forgive some rental payments for a while, as long as they're getting some help on the bank side to keep the tenant in the space or in the apartment, whether it's commercial or residential. They're better off to keep that tenant. So when the tenant gets back on his or her feet, or the entity's feet, they become a rent-paying tenant. Then to get rid of the tenant and go find someone else who could actually pay rent. So I think patience is important here. I mean, I've been in those kinds of situations a lot in my business career, and generally I can tell you, banks don't want to foreclose, landlords don't want to evict, and tenants want to pay their rent. And it's just a question of navigating through it till everybody gets on their feet and that system can be working again.
One more question here. What do you think should be done to prepare for future pandemics or future natural disasters?
I think that is a great question. In fact, I was just watching the hearings this morning and on the COVID-19 situation, and I've actually gone back and started reading the after action reports from the 2009-2010 H1N1 pandemic, and I believe, based on the reading I've done so far, that the government really dropped the ball after that pandemic in 2009-2010. I think it wasn't nearly as severe as this pandemic. We know that, but it was a warning pandemic, and the government's actions after that, I based on the reading I've done so far, was entirely inadequate. I even found a paper written about masks after the 2009-2010 pandemic. And so I think what we need to do this time is lessons learned. There's a lot of lessons to be learned from this. And we need to take an objective view of what was done in this pandemic at every level, from the Chinese Communist Party to the local level, to the president, to Congress, to states, to municipalities. We need to really, really take an objective review of all this. And there's a lot of lessons to be learned. And listen, I think people made some really good decisions. People made some not so good decisions in the situation we find ourselves. I mean, we are in the unknown, and I believe people were acting in good faith and doing the best they could and making the best decisions they could. And Monday morning quarterbacking to criticize politically, I don't think is healthy. but I think an objective to review for lessons learned is important and necessary. Mia, I think you're muted, Mia, if you're.
Yep, I'm muted. I'm not now. I have a question about the Supreme Court. One of your jobs, if you're elected to the Senate, would be to vote on court appointments, and especially the Supreme Court is going to be, a big topic of discussion in the coming weeks and months, possibly. Do you believe that every nominee put forth by a president is entitled to a hearing before the Senate? And if no, why not?
Yeah. What I believe, first of all, the situation we find ourselves in is pretty clear from the precedent, historic precedent, that it is the president ought to appoint somebody, and the Senate ought to consider that person and whether that person should be confirmed or not. So I think the precedent is very clear on that. Now the part of your question of every nominee, should they get a hearing? I think the precedent is clear that in those situations in an election year where the power is held by one party with the president and another party by the Senate, that the precedent is there is not a confirmation process in the Senate. So, and then I think there's other scenarios where an appointee isn't entitled to get a hearing.
But in terms of the precedent that you're citing, that only became a precedent 4 years ago when the Senate didn't offer a hearing for Merrick Garland, President Obama's nominee. Is every decision that gets made like that moving forward become the new precedent?
Well, I think there's precedent that goes back beyond that addresses that scenario, Bill. At least that's what I've read. I have not done the research myself, but I know that others have gone back and looked at that.
And so what would be the theory there that one of the two chambers of Congress is in the same party as the president, that makes a difference, versus both chambers being in the president's party or neither chamber being in the president's party? I'm not sure I get the reasoning there.
Well, first of all, I think, in fact, Mitt Romney's statement, and everybody was concerned about what Mitt Romney was going to do with this. And his statement, in fact, I just read it before I got on here. He talks about the historic precedent that goes back further, distinguishing the situation now from 2016. And both those situations have historic precedent. As far as the logic behind it, I think the logic is pretty clear. I mean, it's, the election of 2018 has consequences, and the election of 2016 has consequences. And I think everyone ought to do their job. Everyone ought to go forward. And as far as the Senate goes in 2016, I mean, they had the ability and power to not proceed, and that was the consequence of the 2014 election, and it's okay for them to exercise that power. I don't think there's a question here that if politically it was flip-flopped, that the Democrats would be doing the very same thing. And so I don't, as far as the politics of this, I think either side would be doing the very same thing.
Okay. So moving on, as a former soldier and a father of 2 West Point cadets. I'm sure you have strong views on our country's engagements abroad. Particularly, I'm thinking of Afghanistan and the Middle East, which are situations we've been in for quite some time. And there's been some cost there. And at the same time, it seems that the situations in those locations aren't really, those conflicts aren't settled. You mentioned earlier agreeing with the president in terms of bringing troops back home. Is that like a full-on thing? We should try to bring all our troops out of those situations, and then what kind of what are you leaving behind in those situations, and what's the pay? What's the trade-off of having troops in a place that's unsettled or not?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I now have one son who's a West Point cadet. My other son graduated in June, and he's now a second lieutenant down at Fort Benning, Georgia, going through the infantry officer's basic course.
Oh, congratulations.
So, thank you. Thank you. It was pretty cool. He graduated on June 13th and had the privilege of saluting the president, and the president endorsed me the day before. So it was an exciting 24 hours for us. Yeah. I believe that we need to bring our troops home from these battle areas, these war areas, Afghanistan, Iraq. I think our allies, we need to have troop employments, where with our allies at strategic locations, NATO, for example. I think it's important that we keep some troops there. I think in Afghanistan, it's important that we maintain an intelligence capability and a counterinsurgency capability. And I know the Pentagon has studied that, how we can do that without having boots on the ground in Afghanistan. But I am generally for bringing the troops home from these conflicts, but keeping them deployed with our allies. And I think this is an important subject because, and let me just give you an example. When the president redeployed those soldiers off the Turkish border in Syria, it was a redeployment of about, I think, 20 to 50 soldiers to get out of the way of the Turks coming across. And something really bothered me in an interview that Jean Shaheen gave about that situation. And I would encourage you to look at it, where she was criticizing the president for that move, and that she said that, we could keep those troops there because it's a minor cost, that the Kurds are taking most of the casualties, and that we've only lost a few of our troops. I think for a U.S. senator to characterize losing soldiers as a minor cost in that kind of situation where they're just sitting on the border is demonstrates to me that she's been in Washington, D.C. too long. So yeah, I think we need to strengthen our alliances. And if you look at what President Trump's been able to accomplish in the Middle East, and with these peace agreements with the UAE and Bahrain recently, and it is remarkable, and that he's bringing peace to the Middle East, and it doesn't get much attention right now, but what he's been able to navigate and accomplish with respect to the Middle East, he has diminished the influence and power of Iran, and brought more peace to the Middle East, and that's been a great accomplishment.
And just to I guess broaden the inquiry a little bit, just as a question of policy, what are your thoughts on what circumstances the U.S. ought to be engaging with our military forces abroad. You know, under the War Powers Act, the Senate would have a say in when we do that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would say we are not good at nation building, and we should not be in the nation building business. That's first and foremost. Secondly, you know, I'm a believer in the Powell doctrine, Colin Powell, where he essentially said, you know, have an objective, go in with overwhelming force to accomplish the objective. The objective has got to be a significant national security interest, and then have an exit strategy to get out of there right away. So if there is a compelling, significant national security interest, I think that would justify going in, as long as we can accomplish the objective and have an immediate exit strategy.
Okay. Yeah.
Sorry, was just finishing up some notes. Our intelligence experts here in the U.S. are pretty concerned about certain foreign powers, specifically Russia and China, attempting to have some impact on our elections. Can you talk a little bit about, you know, what can be done in the short term to prevent that from happening, and also what can be done in the long term to sort of ensure that it doesn't come up again? Yeah. You know, first of all, we need to do everything we can to stop that. You know, on social media, through the internet, through to the extent they're using resources on the ground. We need to do everything we can to stop it. I think secondly, everybody needs to recognize and understand, I think Democrats and Republicans, that the purpose of them doing that is to create discord, to create distrust in our election process. Their objective is to get us fighting with each other over it. Their objective is to get people not trusting our form of government. You know, I know there's a lot of politics flying around about this government favors that person or this person, and my belief is they don't favor anybody. They want this fighting going on. They want this distrust of our form of government. They want suspicion about our elections. And I think we all need to recognize that's what their objective is, to undermine our elections. And then I think there needs to be accountability. To the extent that these governments are doing these things, they need to be held accountable. The Chinese Communist Party needs to be held accountable. Vladimir Putin needs to be held accountable. You know, I saw what's his name, the former national security advisor, the 3-star general. I can't remember his name. I should remember it, but he was being interviewed. His book just came out, where he was saying that the actions that President Trump had taken in the past against Vladimir Putin for the election interference was incredibly severe actions, closing their embassy in San Francisco and kicking people out and on, you know, but that he felt like President Trump's rhetoric wasn't great as it relates to Putin. But we need to hold these governments accountable, and we need to take action to send them a strong message not to do that. Do you have any thoughts on what actions might be taken to address the problem?
Yeah, sure. I think, you know, first of all, what President Trump did in closing embassies, he closed the facility that the Chinese had in Houston, I think, not long ago, which was thought to be a significant spying facility. So those kind of actions, you know, kicking diplomats out of the country is important. I think economic actions. I think you know, flexing our economic muscle against these countries as consequences for this kind of stuff is a very effective way to send a strong message. And to use our strength, our trading strength, against them is important.
So you mentioned tariffs earlier, and you just mentioned trade, which is a great segue, because my next question has to do with that. What are your feelings on trade deals such as the USMCA or the TPP versus negotiating directly with nations through tariffs and other measures?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think it's very situationally dependent. I think the baseline for all that is we need to recognize a few things. One is, for example, when we did the trade deals with China back in the 90s and let them into the World Trade Organization. And the hope then was by opening up trade with China, it would liberalize their politics. That the hope was that by bringing them into the community of nations economically, that in fact they would go to a more free society. Well, we now know that hasn't worked. All right, what it has done is it has strengthened the Chinese Communist Party economically and militarily. So we need to look at that trade arrangement, from the reality of what's happening with the Chinese Communist Party today. The same thing, I think, applies to our trade with Europe. I think our trade arrangements with Europe were essentially created during the period post-World War II. And they were designed to help the European economies come back from the devastation of World War II. And that's why they tended to be unfair in favor of European nations, because it was in the interest of NATO and the West to have those free European countries bring back their economies in a significant way. Well, that's happened, so those trade deals now need to be looked at from the perspective of what the economic situation is today, and the trade deals need to be fair and free. Now, I think it's okay to do trade deals with a group of countries, as long as there is progress and movement to a fair and free trade deal. To the extent that doesn't happen, and we need to go with a one-on-one trade deal, then we should. We shouldn't allow obstacles created by negotiating with a group of nations to stop us from doing unilateral trade deals. And just the mere fact that we're willing to do that will give us leverage in negotiating with a group of nations. Bill, your mic is.
Sorry, I thought I had hit the button. So it sounds like you might be in favor of when we do trade deals, maybe having some mechanism to revisit them periodically as dynamics change. Does that sound reasonably like what you're describing, or?
Sure. I mean, things change all the time, and we ought to have enough flexibility to go back and revisit things. Now, when I say change, I don't mean change within 6 months. We're talking about, more significant, longer term change over a matter of years.
Sure.
But yes, I mean, we and ultimately, I think the place we ought to be is have fair and free trade that is in fact fair and free, and the circumstances then to revisit them, I think, become less likely to occur.
Okay, I have another reader question for you on another topic. And that question is, in what ways do you hope to better racial equity and racial justice in our state and in our country?
Yeah. Yeah. You know, we need to have the courage to sit down and bring everybody together and have a very open discussion about the state of race relations in this country, and we need to make sure that it is a broad discussion where everything is on the table. I mean, and when I say everything, I'm everything from what's happening in the communities where people of color live in our inner cities, and how we can help that situation economically and otherwise. What's happening with law enforcement. I think there's no question that the law enforcement community does not want people in law enforcement who are bad apples. They don't want them there, and we have to deal with that situation as well. So there's a lot to deal with, but we need a discussion about all of these issues. I think it's very tragic that we have going on in the inner city of our major cities, Chicago, New York, these weekend shootings that are just, it's mostly black on black crime, and there's I mean from 60 shootings a weekend where there's 10 or 15 people getting killed every weekend in Chicago, and it's something we don't hear about. And so we got to bring all these issues to the table, and including education. And the people of color in the inner cities want their kids educated, and they're not getting educated. You just look at the results in Baltimore from the schools, and they're horrific. And people want safety, they want security, they want education. And so we got it. We have to have the courage to put all these issues on the table, and to get the politics out of the way, and to work to solve these problems, and forget about who the African American community votes for. We need to help people of color, but we can't do it with sort of this hyper intense focus on one piece of the problem while we ignore other pieces of the problem.
I wonder, just as a quick follow, do you see President Trump convening such a discussion?
I think President Trump has helped people of color tremendously during his administration. With the reforming I forget, the First Step Act, the funding for historically black colleges and universities. I think he's done some really, really good things for the African American community. I think he would welcome that kind of discussion. I think the politics of it right now are so intensely divisive that it would be difficult for him to do that right now.
Would you start out, you said that kind of meeting would need to include everybody or everyone. Who are you envisioning taking part in that?
Oh man, I would bring everybody in from the law enforcement community to all political sides of the African American community. I mean, there are, from the Al Sharpton side to the Thomas Sowell side, and because there are conservative African Americans who have a very different view of this. So let's get them at the table too. And the same thing with the Hispanic community and the Asian community and the religious community and the educational community. And we got to bring everybody in. We can't exclude anybody. I mean, there are very differing opinions in the African American community about how to solve these problems, and so we need to be open-minded to listen to everybody's perspective on it. I think over the last several decades, since the 60s, I mean, we have spent a lot of money to help minorities, and we haven't done a very good job of helping them. And we need to step back and say, okay, what have we done wrong? What have we done right? What can we do better to solve these problems? So I come at this from a pretty unique perspective. And I mean, I grew up in Altoona, Pennsylvania, as you all know. My best friends in grade school were African Americans. They were my best friends. I went into the Army, and back then the Army was a very integrated institution. And so I know a lot of politicians say this, but I truly do come at this from a colorblind perspective because of how I grew up and my background. I mean, when I was leading an infantry company in West Germany in the early 80s, 2/3 of my troops were African American and Hispanic. I think these issues are so politicized today that it damages people of color, and we need to get rid of that. We need to get everyone at the table. We need to talk about real solutions, and we need to spend the money to help, to get things done.
Just to follow up with a related question, do you believe that systemic racism is a problem in law enforcement?
I'm sorry?
Just to follow up, do you believe that systemic racism is a problem in law enforcement?
No, I don't. And the reason I don't is, there are approximately 800,000 law enforcement officers in this country. There are approximately 300 million interactions that law enforcement has each and every year. And if you look at all that and you look at the instances where a law enforcement officer is a bad apple and is racist, it is such a tiny percentage that I think it's inappropriate to say there's systemic racism in law enforcement.
But what about the incidents that keep happening in different places around the country that are, most recently documented on video?
Yeah, I mean, if we go over those instances, I mean, I'm not sure which one you're talking about, but the first thing I would say, there's like 3 or 4 or 5 of them, I think, or 6 or 7. I don't know how many you're talking about, but I would put it in the context of the 300 million interactions that law enforcement have every year. Now, I think no question, the situation in Minneapolis with George Floyd and that law enforcement officer was horrific. How that guy was able to survive in that police department for, 20 years with as many complaints he had against them was wrong, inappropriate, and that needs to be solved. So that was a horrific example. The one that happened recently in Lancaster, I mean, based on the video that I've seen, and I like to withhold judgment on these things till I get all the information. But that person was attacking the police officers with a knife. I think so. So each of these, I think we need to look at all the facts. I think it's wrong to say, that if there's a law enforcement officer and a shooting of an African American, that therefore that means that law enforcement officer is racist. That's just not the conclusion unless the facts bear that out to be the case. So I don't think the instances mean these law enforcement officers are racist. I would just ask you, put yourself in that situation. You get called out on a 911 call, whether it's domestic violence, sexual assault, and you're dealing with a suspect who's resisting, who's fighting. Those law enforcement officers are human beings, and they're afraid.
Excuse me. I have a question about immigration. Do you support a path to citizenship for children whose parents brought them here when they were young, also referred to as dreamers? And if so, what would that look like?
Mm-hmm. So we're talking about the so-called DACA situation. Yeah. I think for true DACA people, and when I say that, I think we have to be very careful about when you say when they were brought here when they were young. I think you can put some of these young people in different categories. Someone who is 17 when they came here is different than someone who was 3 months old. All right. So, but yes, I think for DACA, for true DACA people, they should be given a legal status in the United States. And then they should be given the opportunity after some period of time to apply for citizenship as anyone else would.
Two follow-up questions to that. What is the age kind of cutoff that you're envisioning? You say there's a difference between a 17.
Yeah. I don't know. I just think it's got to be some common sense involved here.
Yeah. Are you thinking teenagers should be a cutoff, or just young children?
No. Listen. I think a 13-year-old, should be given the opportunity to stay here. Again, and maybe you do some sort of sliding, scale situation where, the time period before someone can apply for citizenship for those who came here when they were very young is shorter than the time period for those who came here when they were 17. But I think we just need to bring some common sense to this and have some compassion. These folks came here under difficult circumstances. They've been here. They know America. They're part of our society, and we need to take a compassionate approach with them.
Thank you.
So to kind of switch gears from social issues a little bit for a moment to financial, you support a balanced budget amendment. You support reducing business taxes, payroll tax holiday, but also strengthening our military budget and strengthening the southern border, which arguably would require some spending. How do you do all of that? Because there's only so much in resources.
Yeah. I first of all, I would say that we need to look at all this through the lens of $22 trillion of debt pre-COVID. $22 trillion of debt pre-COVID. Now, I don't know what the number is, $28 trillion of debt. And the reason I emphasize pre-COVID is our federal government spending has been out of control for a very, very long time. And we must fix that. It is imperative that we fix that. And it's one of the reasons, a very important reason why me as a political outsider is running against a career politician. I mean, if you see Jean Shaheen's ads and she's bragging about getting 10 times as much money for the opioid crisis as someone had asked for, but we still have an opioid crisis, So this idea of more money, we have to get out of that. Now, how do we do it? I like Rand Paul's penny plan, where you're actually cutting a penny on a consistent basis. I think the federal government spending is generally very, very inefficient. And I think cutting actually cutting, and that in DC, they talk about reducing spending by reducing the increases in spending. I'm talking about actually cutting spending. And there is no question in my mind that each part of the government in the discretionary side can cut that spending, including the Pentagon. I asked the Chief of Staff of the Army, General McConville. I said, "Come on!" I said, "Can't you cut spending and still accomplish the mission?" And he said, "Absolutely. It's such a huge bureaucracy that it's going to take a lot of will, a lot of political will, to actually cut the spending." One of the things I propose is that we put a hiring freeze on the bureaucracy, except for very critical positions, and then we allow the bureaucracy to attrit over time. And my business experience and my experience with dealing with the government in my business career, I can just tell you that I've been in situations where the government has had so many people involved in matters, but don't call them at 5:01 p.m. because they're not there. And I've been involved, and they say, "Okay, you have to get this back to us in a week." So you get it back to them in a week, and then you don't hear from them for 5 months. And I'm not saying that the folks that work in the government are bad people. It's just that there is too much there. And it's the old saying, if you want to get something done right and quickly, you give it to the busiest person. So I think we need to shrink the bureaucracy, and I think you can shrink the bureaucracy and actually have better service. And I say that from a private sector perspective. I think there's so many redundant and duplicative programs that, one department might be doing the same thing as another department, and you're spending money on both, and they don't even know they're doing the same thing. So shrink the bureaucracy, cut spending, get rid of the duplication, and it's going to be hard to do given the nature of our politics. We see it all the time. I'm going to spend more money. I'm going to get you more money, so elect me. I mean, we're seeing it right now, and it's it's been going on for decades. It's been going on by Republicans and Democrats. It has to stop. It absolutely has to stop.
Okay. Mia?
Yeah, you in the past have said that you're not a huge fan of the Affordable Care Act. If given an opportunity to sort of weigh in on some possible changes or eliminations from portions of that legislation, what would you want to keep and what would you maybe want to get rid of or change?
Well, I think the first thing is nobody should be denied health insurance coverage because of a pre-existing condition. All right, nobody should be denied health insurance coverage or any kind of health care because of a pre-existing condition. All right. So that's first and foremost. When I think about healthcare, I think about 4 principles. Okay. Affordability, accessibility, quality, and options. People have choices. All right. And I think we can accomplish those things in a number of ways. One is, to bring more transparency to our whole healthcare system. In fact, when I was talking to the executives of these hospitals, I asked them, how can we get cost of healthcare down? And that's the first thing they brought up is bringing more transparency. And the example they gave me is, so someone comes in to see their primary care physician, and the primary care physician gives them 5 tests. And the primary care physician says, okay, we're going to send you off to a specialist. And they go off to the specialist, and the specialist gives them the same 5 tests. And the patient has no idea that it's the very, you show up, you see the specialist, and the specialist says, I got to give you these tests. When, a patient could say, wait a minute, I just got here, use these tests, kind of a thing. So I think transparency is very important. I think competition is very important to accomplish those 4 objectives. The other thing that I talk about a lot is tort reform. There is far too many frivolous lawsuits that occur in the medical field. And I say that from the perspective that my law firm has a very active medical malpractice defense. We represent a lot of hospitals and doctors, and not only is it the cost of the litigation, but make no mistake about it, that doctors and hospitals practice medicine defensively in anticipation of frivolous lawsuits. It's going on every day, and it drives up the cost a goodly amount. So I think there's solutions here. I think the prescription drug prices need to come down. I think President Trump's executive order will help that. But I think market forces, transparency, selling assurance across state lines, all those things will help to come up with an affordable, high quality, accessible healthcare system where people have options.
Follow up briefly. As you probably have learned, there are many areas of the state where competition is not realistic in the healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
So you've called for greater competition. How does that get achieved? And is that for the states to do, or is that a federal role?
Yeah, I'm a big believer in having the states doing that. And I think you're right. I think the North Country in New Hampshire, would be difficult to bring a lot of competition from the medical service providers, although I think you could have some competition from insurance companies. Now, I think the hospitals in the North Country have withstood the COVID-19 situation pretty well, based on my interviews with the executives there. But I think it's a state and local issue. I think the more the federal government can get out of the way, the better. I know there's funding that has to occur. I know, for example, in New Hampshire with the COVID-19 situation, the people going on Medicaid has increased dramatically. And so those folks who were impacted by COVID-19 are going to get health insurance coverage through Medicaid.
I had one other follow-up. In the past, you've talked about reducing regulations and providing waivers when it comes to Medicare and Medicaid to help seniors and people with disabilities. Can you just describe what those waivers are and exactly what you mean by that?
Well, yeah, I'm not sure when I said that, but what I would say is, to the extent that government can get out of the way and the bureaucracy could get out of the way and the red tape could get out of the way to help people, that ought to be done. and there's just far too often where where government and red tape hinder people from getting the medical care they need. And to the extent we can accomplish that by providing waivers, we ought to be doing that.
So just so that I make sure I'm understanding you clearly, you're basically just saying that, the government should provide the resources for people to get this care, but not be too involved in the actual carrying out of providing the care?
Yeah, I think I read a stat somewhere that, when the federal government is involved with all the medical stuff, that every dollar spent on medical, 23 cents of it goes to the bureaucracy. And that's, that's just crazy in my opinion. And that's, I think, one of the problems with too much bureaucracy, because, it starts building on itself. And again, I think it's people operating in good faith and trying to do good things. But that's the nature of bureaucracy. And that's why it's important that we mitigate the size of it.
So I want to touch on one other issue that's kind of a larger societal thing, and now I know you've been called by critics a climate denier, but I think actually what you've said is that the evidence isn't conclusive that human actions are driving those changes. I don't, you can certainly describe that better than I can. But the trends are pretty clear in terms of melting ice caps and severity of weather. And so if that's the case, shouldn't, regardless of the cause, shouldn't we be taking steps to deal with that kind of enormous shift and the threat that it poses? And what would you propose or support in terms of that?
Yeah. First of all, climate change is occurring. All right. Climate change is occurring. There's no question it's occurring. So secondly, we have one Earth, and we all ought to do whatever we can do, whatever is within our abilities to conserve this Earth and treat it respectfully and carefully. I have done that in my personal life. I've helped conserve over 250 acres here where I live, and I do a lot of things in my personal life to conserve and preserve, and so that's second. I think thirdly, like so many of these issues, it has become very politicized, and there are some very extreme views on this on both sides. And I've actually, I'll just tell you, when I decided over a year ago to do this, I've read a lot on this, and I'm by no means an expert, because there's a lot out there. But something's really clear to me is that, this issue has become far too politicized at the UN and in various other areas. And one of the things I have proposed is, to put together a group of unbiased scientists, if you can find them, and some have said, well, the UN has done that. Well, I'm not sure. I don't know that what the UN has done is unbiased, but and really come up with some recommendations about this. um, and and to determine if there's something that we could actually do to mitigate this. And I say that from the perspective of, we know that the climate of the earth has been changing forever, and so whether we can actually impact that, and how we can impact that, and can we impact it in a positive way that isn't going to have such severe damage on the world economy that we have a severe poverty problem. So I think I think the left has utilized this issue as a way to advance their agenda in other areas. That's why if you read the new Green New Deal that was originally proposed, there's just a lot of stuff in there that has nothing to do with climate change, but it's part of the Green New Deal. So that's how I would proceed with it. But it's hard. I mean, the scientists who take a position that is different than the orthodoxy that we see out of the UN, I mean, they get really beat up over their positions, and that's just too bad, because it doesn't allow for the kind of discussion that's needed to come up with some reasonable ways to address this.
Okay, so related to that topic, and you mentioned the new Green Deal, and a lot of that does have to do with energy and our energy choices. You want to reduce our reliance on foreign sources of energy. How do you propose we go about that? What are your energy must-haves, or?
Well, right now we're energy independent, and I think we should continue to be energy independent. And I think we need to work on ways to reduce the amount of carbon-based energy that we use. I think we're now seeing that the major automobile manufacturers are doing more and more with electric cars, and that's a good thing. And Tesla led the way on that, and we're seeing the free market help them move in that direction. I think we need to focus on renewable energy sources as well. And until we can figure out ways to do that, I think natural gas is a good, clean, about the best clean burning carbon based energy that we have. I think nuclear power is something that we need to reconsider and look at and focus on. As a clean energy source of electric power, and other renewables, and empower the market to help us find those solutions.
Switching topics here. The Second Amendment is important to a lot of people in New Hampshire, and what do you interpret the scope of the rights laid out in the Second Amendment?
Yeah, I think it was the Heller decision that was decided in 2011, 2012 that I think laid out those rights pretty clearly, as far as the right to keep and bear arms, and the right to self-defense, and the defense of your person and property. So yeah, I'm a strong supporter of the Second Amendment, and I support the Heller decision.
In light of the mass shootings over the years, is there anything that you think should be done on that front? Any kind of limitations put forth? Or do you think there should be things done in other ways?
Well, I would say the first thing that needs to be done is the law enforcement, the schools, the communities, need to enforce the laws that are on the books. I mean, we know in the Parkland situation that there were failures at the school level, at the local law enforcement level, at the state law enforcement level, at even at the federal law enforcement level with respect to that person, and had the system worked there, that could have been prevented. I think those shootings are largely a mental health issue, and we need to make sure that people are doing their jobs and paying attention to those situations where where there's signs that someone might be having an issue.
Would you be in favor of red flag laws when somebody sees that somebody's maybe poses a danger, can say, hey, you ought to look at this person and whether they ought to have access to weapons like that?
Yeah, I am not in favor of red flag laws, as you state that broadly. I think there are processes and procedures in place, even as we exist today, that that if somebody is exhibiting signs of problems and violence, that action can be taken.
Okay. So we're about ready to wrap up. We certainly appreciate you taking the time to
Sure.
talk with us and better inform voters and our readers, and wish you well in the campaign.
Thank you. And thank you for your time, and I hope I answered all your questions.
I just have one more.
Sure.
If voters in our area are looking to find out more information about you, where can they go?
CorkyForSenate.com. Also on our Facebook page, Corky Messner for Senate. And they can also email me, CorkyMessner@gmail.com. Believe it or not, I answer my emails.
All right. Well, again, we're happy. Usually we'd thank somebody for driving over this way, but in this case, we don't have to do that.
Well, I've been down in your neighborhood, I think, at least 7 or 8 times since I started this. So, and I'll be back down there again soon. But thanks for doing it by Zoom. Saved me a drive.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time, and it's been a pleasure.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.